2018 in music was a very strange one, as I've talked about so far in the previous 2 videos I did. Going through my favourite albums and the worst songs of the year like I usually did was a much bigger task than usual, because the majority of music I heard this year was just kind of bland or forgettable. Very little stood out as particularly good or bad, but I think I've just about whittled down my favourite albums of the year. Bear in mind, however, there are some albums on this list that when I reviewed previously in the year, they were given lukewarm scores, and since those reviews, the albums have grown on me, or I just thought I was a little bit too harsh to begin with. So let's get into the list. Here are my top 20 favourite albums of 2018. Now, I can't say that my opinion of Marauder has gotten fonder since my initial review, but it's still an album that I do really enjoy. The album shows Interpol return to the more minimalistic, raw and gritty sounds of their debut and blends it with the catchier and punchier sound of newer records like El Pintor. The album at times feels like the band bringing in all their strengths and putting them on full display with these tense, menacing post-punk anthems. The album is drenched in surrealistic lyrics, atmospheric guitar lines and a huge explosive rhythm section. Seeing the band take some of the risks they do on this album is definitely exciting to see, even if some of them don't really pan out. The album starts off with 4 really fantastic songs that are easily the highlights and very reminiscent of the band's early stuff. There are moments that definitely could have been pulled straight off their debut. The lyrics show Paul Banks discussing more social topics than ever before in a constantly cynical way, which blends well with the aggression and expansiveness of the album. There are moments on the album, however, that I felt didn't really work as well as they could do. The second half of the album especially starts to lose a lot of the great songwriting that the first half had, not to mention Banks's vocals are very odd and can at times be a little bit off-putting. But when this album is good, it's really good and full of some of the band's best music in years. I've not talked too much about them on this channel, but Against Me are one of my favourite punk bands of all time. They were even my most listened to band in 2018 because I listened to Reinventing Axl Rose, New Wave and Transgender Dysphoria Blues very regularly, so I was excited to hear new music from frontwoman Laura Jane Grace. Although I can't say that this new album is quite as good as pretty much all of Against Me's previous work, it's definitely a very open, honest and immediate album. Sonically, the album has a lot in common with the band, especially some of their earlier stuff due to the folk punk nature of many of the songs, but she does embrace a larger influence from a wide range of rock music, including from artists such as Tom Petty, but it's filled with that huge noisy sound that you'd expect from anything released from her. She does a great job of blending together all her influences to create something that is very distinctly her. Songs like Apocalypse Now have a very jangly folk punk sound to them with a really catchy hook, which has been stuck in my head since its release. Grace strips herself down to the barest and most honest she's ever been, and considering the lyrical content of the last couple Against Me records, that's pretty impressive. On the album, Grace sings heavily about love and loss with the spitfiring and cynical lyricism heard on the early Against Me records. She went into the lyrics intending not to overthink anything, which is presented clearly through the stream of consciousness lyrics that are incredibly melancholic and dive into the deepest of Grace's thoughts. The album succeeds so well, I think, because of how much Grace manages to spread her influences while still feeling distinctly punk. Even the bluesier and folk-heavy moments sound like a punk rock song, which is something that only a singer like Grace could achieve. However, it's not perfect. Out of the 14 tracks on the album, there are multiple that doesn't really hit quite as hard as the best songs, but it's still a great treat for any Against Me or folk punk fan. GORILLAZ are one of my all-time favourite bands. Their first 3 albums are incredible masterpieces of pop and electronic music. However, their last couple albums have sucked. Humans was such a huge disappointment that I was not looking forward to anything from a follow-up, especially one released just over a year later, but the Now Now was a surprisingly good album. Damon Albarn wrote and recorded the album very quickly, so the band had more material to play live. To make this happen, instead of bringing every single rapper that Damon Albarn was a fan of and putting them over slightly above average beats, Damon took center stage and made an album that really felt like GORILLAZ again. It almost feels like a 2D solo album at times, which was a huge positive. The album is stylistically not as wide-reaching and experimental as albums like Demon Days or Plastic Beach, with it basically just taking a funky synth-pop inspired direction. But it works really well because not only is Alburn's writing really good, but the instrumentation and production is some of the best to come from the GORILLAZ name in almost a decade. The album strips off all the fat of that previous album and is just the basic formula for a GORILLAZ album, which I can understand being a problem for some, but for me I felt like this was exactly the direction that they needed to take. Songs like Idaho, Trans, Sorcerers, and of course Humility are among the best pop songs to come out this year, and the fact that none of them reached the top of the charts but a guy mumbling about Jackie Chan did is pretty criminal. Although the Now Now still doesn't reach the heights of the band's early work, it returning to basics was a huge step in the right direction and hopefully a sign of much better to come. So I will admit that the first time I listened to ESTRONS, I wasn't really a huge fan. There was something about the singer's voice that I found a little bit off-putting. However, they happened to be at a small local festival I went to a few months ago and I checked their set out, and dear God, they were incredible live. So as soon as I got home, I put their album on, which had literally just came out, and I really got into it. On their debut album, the band does a great job of blending pop melodies with a snarly, biting punk rock backing. They blend elements of post-punk, hardcore, and straight-up punk rock together to create this vitriolic, energetic album full of some of the most in-your-face and aggressive punk songs I've heard this year. From the moment the album starts, it's an unrelenting, powerful record full of energy, sharp guitar riffs, and huge sing-along choruses. The band do a fantastic job of blending different sounds and styles together without ever feeling overcrowded or out of place. Lead singer, I'm not even going to attempt pronouncing that, sings incredibly empowering lyrics that are honest and play against the raw emotion displayed through the instrumentation. Make a Man is a prime example of this, with her lyrics about female sexual dominance that reminds me of the sort of unsubtle lyricism that singers like Liz Phair use. If there's one problem I have with the album, it's that occasionally the production / mixing can sound a little bit cheap and muddy, but luckily it's never to the point where it distracts from the overall album. If you love fast, catchy punk rock, then you can do way worse than this album. I remember when this album came out, I was very mixed towards it. I thought it was full of some really great songs and then some absolutely awful ones, but I kept playing it over and over because I was determined to love it. The Wombats are easily one of my favourite indie bands of all time and I adore their previous 3 records. Eventually it was, however, a grower and I found myself enjoying practically every single song from the record. The album carries on the band's heavy adoption of modern pop music into their sound. However, unlike previous records, this album doesn't really have a lot of the characteristics that make a Wombats album. In many ways it feels like something that any number of pop bands could release, which at first did really put me off. But luckily, due to the band's quirky lyrics, punchy riffs, and fantastic bass work, their identity is still there, just slightly hidden. The album doesn't break any boundaries, but is full of so many catchy and fun indie pop songs that its lack of invention never becomes a problem. Something that, to be fair, could be said about all their previous records as well. Songs like Cheetah Tongue, Lemon to a Knife Fight, Turn, and Black Flamingo shows the band's strength for writing huge sing-along anthems incredibly well. Matthew Murphy's vocals are as strong as ever with his heavy Liverpudlian accent and falsetto, which add a huge amount of charm to the album. The crisp, flashy production adds to the power of the album with the heavy use of guitar effects and atmospheric synthesizers. Despite the band's heavy emphasis on modern pop style writing, on this album they strip away the new wave synth sound of their previous 2 albums and instead replace it with a heavy usage of acoustic guitars and reverb / delay effects on the guitars and vocals. The only issue I have with the album is that when I look at the band's overall discography, I think there's less on this album that really stands out with some of their best songs. I completely understand why I was mixed on it at first, and there are still moments like Dip You in Honey that I'm not completely sold on. But the album's catchy and punchy sound still makes it a worthwhile listen if you're into this type of music. I just recommend checking out their other releases first. Whoa, where did this come from? I've never been the biggest of Mice and Men fan, to be completely honest. I felt like all their albums had a lot of really good songs, but they also had a lot of really terrible or just generic forgettable songs, and sadly a lot of the time the latter outweighed the two. But I was interested in how this album would pan out after the departure of lead singer Austin Carlisle, who had basically been the driving force of the band. Bassist and clean vocalist Aaron Pauley took over full vocal duties, and with the lead singles it seemed like the band was returning more to the nu metal tinged metalcore sound of Restoring Force rather than the bland, plodding and uninteresting nu metal sound of their last album. My interest in the album was never huge because of how hit or miss their other stuff was, but I was definitely curious because I really enjoyed the singles that I heard. And my god, this is such a great album. Admittedly, I don't really listen to a lot of metalcore and stuff like this because I find a lot of it is too samey, some of this band's work included in that. But on DEFY, the band just go crazy and give us 45 minutes of fast, relentless melodic metal with incredible riffs, catchy melodies and hard-hitting lyrics. Listening to this band after the absolute mess of their previous records is like hearing the band wake up and suddenly feeling rejuvenated. The album is full of energy, aggression and some of the most powerful songs to come from this genre in a long time. The band does this pretty impressive thing where they throw in choruses that sound like easy WWE intro contenders, but actually put them behind really well written and exciting songs. They also don't shy away from taking risks and talking about more emotional and poignant subjects, including Forever YDG End, which is a tribute to Austin, and the final song, If We Were Ghosts, that is an emotional tribute to Chester Bennington. The band even do a pretty great cover of Pink Floyd's Money on the song. The risks they make on this album really pan out well and leave us with a collection of the band's best material to date. If you've never really been into this band before, I definitely recommend checking out this album before completely writing them off because it's such a sick album. Jeffy, my boy, welcome to another favourite albums list. We Cool and Worry are easily two of my favourite albums of the decade, so when Post got a surprise release on January 1st, I was right on there and spun it constantly for weeks. At first, I loved it and thought it was just as good as the previous two albums. And then I sat on it a while, went back to it and realised that it really isn't that great. Now don't get me wrong, some of the songs on this album are among the best he's ever done. USA should have been on my favourite songs video and I honestly don't know why I completely forgot about it. Same with the song Let Them Win, both of which are these expansive punk rock jams. But the album just isn't quite as emotional or experimental as the previous two albums. Now enough of me saying bad things, this is supposed to be a good review. Post is an album that paints the current political landscape of the world in the angriest and bleakest way possible. Jeff shouting "We're tired, we're bored" during the 7-minute opener USA perfectly encapsulates the frustration that he portrays on each and every track. The album is an incredibly rough and raw slice of power pop tinged punk rock with a message even more powerful now than it was when it was released a year ago when it came out. It's an album full of the smarmy attitude and uproarious huge sing-along choruses that you'd expect from Rosenstock, mixed with the rough vintage synthesizers that have been slightly absent since his Bomb the Music Industry days. In many ways this album feels like a step back to some of the later albums released through that band due to its crunchy and noisy production and socially political lyrical content. Although there are a few songs in its 10-track track listing that I'm not a huge fan of in the slightest, the album is one that when it shines it's almost blinding. It was an album we needed at the beginning of the year and it's an album that we need even more now considering how much worse things have gotten in the last 12 months. I have to admit that after hearing the first two singles from this album, Jumpsuit and Nico and the Niners, I didn't expect this album would be good, let alone end up on this list. Just like every 21 Pilots album, Trench is a huge album that glides across different genres effortlessly without ever feeling out of place. Just like their last album, it's a concept album that deals with the subjects of mental health, suicide and self-doubt. This time presented within the narrative of the metaphorical city known as Dima. The album takes wider influences from different types of music than ever before and presents them in a way that feels constantly unique and interesting. The instrumentation is superbly written with elements of rock, jazz, electronica, hip-hop, reggae and pop all coming together to create something incredibly fascinating. Lyrically, for the most part, the band have never been more creative and ambitious. The album is this huge journey that encapsulates you with its interesting narrative which is incredibly well thought out. The narrative is like a puzzle with all the pieces pieces scattered throughout each song for you as the listener to put together. Because of that, it's an album that I think requires multiple listens for all the pieces to come together. The songs on this album are easily some of the best the band have ever done, due to not only the band's songwriting and performance showing them at their A game, but the production being some of the most polished and cohesive the band have ever done. They've matured massively on this album, with very few moments feeling super cringy and like they're pandering to their teenage fans. The band is way more low-key than before, which makes the songs more fascinating and rewarding on multiple listens. Many of the songs that I hated at first, when I listened to them multiple times, they ended up growing on me. Songs like Jumpsuit, Neon Gravestones, and Bandito actually ended up being some of my favorites on the album. Of course, it's far from perfect. There are still a few songs on it that not only don't work in the slightest but are actually terrible. Chlorine, Nico and the Niners, and Pet Cheetah are flat out awful and 3 of the worst songs I heard in 2018. I honestly think without these songs this album would probably have been in my top 5, but they bring it down so much that it left me barely returning to the album after the first month of its release. But despite that, I actually ended up really liking this thing. I think it may be my favourite album from the band to date, which I honestly did not expect in the slightest. Courtney Barnett's debut album, Sometimes I Sit and Think and Sometimes I Just Sit, was easily one of my favourite albums of 2015. Although admittedly, compared to some of the albums I put on the list that year, it's not one that I regularly return to. Songs like Elevator Operator and Debbie Downer are still songs that I regularly play. I love her cynical, sarcastic and intriguing lyrical storytelling on that album. So I was very excited for her follow-up Tell Me How You Really Feel, especially after loving the single Nameless Faceless. I remember when it came out, I was incredibly mixed towards it. I thought some songs were really great and catchy indie rock jams with fantastic lyrics and incredibly noisy grunge-inspired instrumentation, but there were a lot of moments that didn't quite stick with me, hence why I didn't really rave over it in that review I did. But it's an album that I find myself admiring and adoring more every time I listen to it. Barnett explores feelings of frustration and the challenge of the number of high expectations that were placed on her after her debut. Instead of the comedic, highly descriptive Dylan-esque lyrics on the debut, she goes down a much more simple and smaller route instead, one that borrows huge influence from bands like Hole and Pavement, as well as singers like Liz Phair. The instrumentation is full of fantastic riffs and incredible progressive moments like the 2-part City Looks Pretty. The lyrics are very raw and in many cases feel like first drafts, but I feel like that kind of adds to the charm of the album. It's a much more direct and straightforward record than the last, which may not work for a lot of people, but I personally found really charming. Although not quite as fantastic and well-rounded as the debut, this album is still full of some really great tunes that were among my favourites this year. Slaves seem to be the modern punk equivalent of Marmite. You either love them or hate them. I think their blend of comedic, politically and socially charged lyrics with the garagey, blues rock inspired riffs made them, although not incredibly original, but definitely a lot of fun to listen to. And honestly, I would even wholeheartedly say that I thought their second album, Take Control, was really good and doesn't deserve the hate that it gets. I was very skeptical towards their third album after hearing the song Cut and Run and thinking it lacked the energy and excitement that I normally expected from the band, but when I threw the album on, I was instantly treated to the lead vocalist Isaac screaming "Oi" and throwing insults toward a character based on the average social media user. The album is Slaves cutting everything down to the bone, cutting off all the fat of their previous 2 records and leaving us with a half-hour blast of everything that they're good at. The album is full of these incredibly visceral, in-your-face guitar riffs, pounding drum lines and snotty vocals that never get tiresome even in the album's slower moments. The duo covers a lot of important ground across the 9-song track list as they deliver fast-paced songs about their frustrations with the government and socialistic issues that we deal with from day to day. Lyrically, the album is pure genius and at times absolutely hilarious. There is not a single dull moment on the album. Every single song is a pure punk rock banger, and in a year full of absolutely incredible punk albums, that's very impressive.
1, 2, 3, play!
The fact that this album is still so high up on the list after so many moments is a true testament to how good this thing is. The band's debut is one that I was kinda late getting into, but once I discovered it, I absolutely fell in love with it. I found their blend of post-hardcore and math exciting and refreshing. So when I heard the first song from the new album play, I was very skeptical because it took things in a much more straightforward alternative rock direction. But I was open-minded and let the album work its magic, and it's one that gripped its claw on me straight away. Although nowhere near as fast and aggressive as the first album, it's one that brings in a wide array of influences from the rock pantheon. It still has all that urgent attitude that made their first album so great, but blended in with catchy radio-friendly choruses, which I understand may divide a lot of people. The band hired producer Gil Norton, whose previous work with Pixies, Foo Fighters and Feeder have a clear influence on the album. His production work is incredible, and he adds so much to the mix without ever losing what makes the band unique. The album is led by huge guitar riffs, crushing drumming and incredibly intense and emotional vocals. The additional emphasis on melody is one that may be a little bit confusing at first if you're more used to the screaming scene on the first album, but in many ways I don't think that this album is that far removed from its predecessor. In fact, I feel like this album improves on a lot of that album's best qualities. The songs are just as exciting as ever and full of the band's unique brand of controlled chaos. Songs like Meant to Be and Major System Error display this perfectly, with Becca screaming, the crushing huge guitar riffs, and huge choruses that beg for people to scream them back while simultaneously flying around the mosh pit. Although songs like Insomnia and Lost in Translation are huge lows on the album, and honestly two of the worst songs the band have ever done, they're easy to ignore because of how many great rock tunes are on there. In fact, the song Meant to Be was my most listened to song in 2018 according to my Spotify Wrapped, so that has to be proof that this album is full of some great jams. Dear God, this thing still rips so damn hard. The final release of the band's recent trilogy, Bad Witch, is this incredibly destructive album full of that classic industrial rock sound that made albums like The Downward Spiral so damn great. But there's a lot more experimenting seen here than ever before, as the band take huge influence from jazz and experimental rock to create what is some of the most visceral and exciting music they've done in almost 2 decades. The album is a much smaller release than usual from the band, which I think makes it so much more attractive and appealing. Over the years, the band's huge concepts have started to get a little bit old, so it's nice to see them abandoning that to create just straightforward industrial rock. The album opens with Shit Mirror and Ahead of Ourselves, which are these reckless, incredibly energetic songs that are easily 2 of the most exciting listening experiences I've had this year. After that, the album starts to delve into the more ambient and hypnotic jazz-inspired songs like the incredible God Break Down the Door, which is possibly my favourite Nine Inch Nails song to come out of this trilogy. In fact, I'd probably go as far as to say it's one of my favourite Nine Inch Nails songs since With Teeth. On Bad Witch, the band take many elements from their basic structure, blend it with new experimental passages, and then crush it into this heavily distorted, glitchy, and incredibly loud sound that is more nihilistic and fiercer than anything they've done probably since The Fragile. Trent Reznor's vocals on the album are fantastic, despite not being very prominent in many of the songs. On the song God Breaks Down the Door, he sings with an almost crooning style, clearly inspired by David Bowie, which sounds incredible. Vocally, it's completely different to anything he's ever done before, and he pulls it off flawlessly. The lyrics throughout the album are very bare and at times quite simple, but their simplicity leaves their meanings up to your own interpretation, which I think makes them even more fascinating. Mixed in with the really diverse and eclectic music, it makes this album one of the most engrossing and odd albums I heard in 2018, and by far my favourite Nine Inch Nails album since The Fragile. This is an album that I discovered very late into the year, but one that quickly shot its way up the list from being an honourable mention to being placed in the top 10. On his 4th solo album, Hammond Jr. proves once again that he is the only member of the Strokes making consistently great solo material. Sure, Julian Casablancas' synth-pop album was pretty good, and the stuff he did with The Voids is interesting, but it's not quite Francis Trouble. The album blends the frenetic, crunchy and riff-heavy garage punk that made albums albums like Is This It So Great, with a wide variety of influences all the way from classic rock to R&B. The album takes a much darker direction than Hammond's previous records, taking inspiration from the miscarriage of his twin brother before he was born. Learning the story led him to learn more about himself, which he explores throughout the album through these huge sing-along indie rock songs that are dramatic, exciting, and just all around fun to listen to. The album is constantly bright and sharp due to its incredibly memorable riffs and catchy choruses that at times surpass the last couple of Strokes albums. Of course, although it is very obvious that this album is from a member of that band, Hammond does a good job of setting that album apart from them. Vocally, Hammond comes across incredibly confident in a way that he never really had on his previous solo albums. It feels like he's completely comfortable being the frontman here, and he never shies away from showing everything he's capable of. Some songs show him in a really restrained fashion, and others show him sounding incredibly skittish. Every single song on the album rips hard and is full of some of the most incredible, memorable riffs Hammond has ever written, along with some huge sing-along choruses and instrumentation that is raw and simplistic without ever getting boring. I got into a lot of new music in 2018. I listened heavily to bands that I only really knew a handful of songs by before. Bands like Sonic Youth and The Strokes, both of whom I now kind of consider two of my favourite bands. But one of the biggest of these musical adventures that I took was with Mr. Jack White. I have been a hardcore fan of the White Stripes since I first heard The Hardest Button to Button almost 15 years ago now, but I'd never really ventured out past that band. I got tickets to see him live, which I talked about in my favourite live gigs video I did, and I decided to listen to all of his stuff. His solo stuff, the Raconteur stuff, and of course the Dead Weather stuff, all of which I love. But god damn, Boarding House Reach is easily one of the most exciting and fresh things I've heard from him since Elephant. Jack White has made a name for himself with his signature style of buzz-heavy blues rock, which is obviously heard all over this album, but he does a fantastic job of expanding upon this style with some of the most unique experimentation ever to come from his mind. The album feels like he was just let wild in a studio. Its eccentric attitude is all over the place with a wide array of musical influences from blues and jazz to hip-hop and electronic music. The album is incredibly wild and relentless, completely embracing surreal sounds without ever losing his great knack for pop melodies. The album is one of the noisiest and weirdest listening experiences you'll have from 2018, and it's definitely one that probably won't feel satisfying in the first couple of listens, but when you let the album sink its teeth into you, you can't escape. It's a glitchy, raucous piece of experimental blues rock which is incredibly brave and ambitious without ever feeling like that ambition is unjustified. It's an album full of huge stylistic shifts that all work really well. It feels like you're inside the mind of Jack White, so you kind of learn to accept those moments where things get crazy, and it's an absolutely fascinating album. I really hope the new Raconteurs album is anywhere near as exciting as this thing. Yes, I will admit that I was one of the few people who loved Tranquility bass. So what? I'm a huge Arctic Monkeys fan, and I will admit that this album was a bit of a hard sell. It's a concept album about a hotel on the moon which blends sounds of lounge pop, jazz and glam rock together into this really odd listening experience. But I personally think it works really well. Alex Turner turns from that very sleazy, greasy character he became on the last album into a much more suave character who's incredibly self-aware. He comes off way more mature here than ever before, but at the same time brings back a lot of the more comedic social comedy found on their first couple albums. He surreally stumbles his way through the subjects of technology and fame and twists it into this strange narrative with these fascinating stream of consciousness lyrics that almost feel improvised at times. Turner's vocals are really great on the album with this blend of 60s crooner style vocals with almost Berlin Trilogy era Bowie style vocals. In fact, much of the production and experimentation on this album gives me strong Berlin Trilogy vibes in general. The instrumentation is fascinating with heavy use of pianos, harpsichord and atmospheric otherworldly vintage synthesizers. The album feels like a portrait of the future if it was written in the 1970s. It's a very natural sounding vintage album similar to things like Suck It and See, except way more avant-garde. The huge stylistic switch is something that takes a long time to get used to, but I found it ultimately more rewarding and interesting than anything from AM. The album is the sound of a band maturing and becoming something completely different than ever before. Although many people were mixed towards the album, I can definitely see it being one that, with hindsight, goes on to be considered an important album, one of the best of the last few years. However, some songs don't stick with me too well. The world's first ever monster truck front flip isn't great, and She Looks Like Fun is really awful, but the rest of the album is just fantastic. I think the debut from Snail Mail stands out as one of my most listened to albums of the year. I discovered it a couple months after it came out and must have listened to it pretty much every single day for at least a week. And I know a couple of those days I listened to it like 2 or 3 times. I found it to be this instantly accessible, beautiful slice of bedroom pop / lo-fi indie rock. Frontwoman Lindsay Jordan has crafted a crisp 10-track album full of some of the most emotionally potent, catchy and anarchic indie rock songs to come out in the last couple of years. She sings these incredibly honest, sorrowful tunes about teenage and suburban angst without ever getting overly cliche or pandering. She does a fantastic job of taking depressing subjects like heartbreak and being disillusioned with the world and makes them sound almost uplifting due to the crisp, punchy guitars and huge sing-along hooks. Instrumentally, the album is almost pretty bare bones, with guitars pretty much just playing jangly chords and the only other accompaniment being bass and drums. But the simplicity in the instrumentation puts a huge emphasis on the lyrics and melodies, both of which are absolutely astounding. Jordan sings these songs of insecurities and dark feelings in a way that comes off incredibly confidently and insightful. The album in many ways almost feels like a coming-of-age film condensed into half hour and written by Guyville-era Liz Phair. It's snarky, confident and poised. It's a very simple album, there's not really much in the way of variation or experimentation, but a fantastic songwriting makes that feel almost unnecessary. I say listen to Pristine, which is in my opinion the best song in the album, and if you like it, you're gonna like the rest of the album. This thing was a bit of a shock, to be honest. I absolutely love Metric. Their first few albums were easily some of my favourite in the indie rock new wave revival of the 2000s. Their songs were sharp, catchy and full of some of the most poignant political and social messages in the genre at this time. But the 2010s really haven't been kind to them. Their album Synthetica had some great songs on it, but was overall a bit of a mess, and Pagans in Vegas was god awful. So I was very cautious about this new album. However, when they released the first single, Dark Saturday, my ears perked way up. It seemed like they were going back to that straightforward and unhinged sound of their early material, and every subsequent single seemed to prove this to be the case. I was still cautiously optimistic going into the album, but I was very hopeful, and the album exceeded any expectations that I had and ended up possibly being, in my opinion, the best album these guys have done to date. At least it's very neck and neck with Old World Underground. The album is a collection of all the things that these guys do best, with the very direct and abrasive indie rock sound of songs like Dark Saturday and the title track, and also the very atmospheric 80s new wave tinged synth pop songs like Now or Never Now and No Lights on the Horizon. The album is driven much more by guitar, something that had started to disappear a little in the last 2 albums, and is incredibly refreshing to hear. Guitarist James Shaw really gets to shine on this thing with these huge fiery riffs and use of atmospheric pedals that create these huge musical landscapes that completely engulf you. Emily Haynes' voice is possibly more powerful than anything she's ever done before, as she shows everything she's capable of, whether it's her screaming at the top of her lungs or softly singing about some of the album's darker subjects. The band have always sung about the same topics in their music, whether it's social / political issues in the world or the subject of mental illness and its effect on love, and these subjects are shown all throughout this album, but the songwriting here is so great that it never feels like the band are running low on fuel. In fact, this is the sound of a band completely invigorated. They've learned from their past mistakes and decided to build on all the positives of their past music, and it pays off incredibly well. The album is a long one, clocking in at just under an hour long, but it never feels overly long and never gets boring. It justifies its length because every single song on the album is fantastic, incredibly catchy and full of beautifully produced and composed instrumentation. It's weird how much things can change over time. When this album came out and I talked about it in my Albums I Missed video, I was convinced that this would be my album of 2018. In fact, I have to say that it was only when I sat down and listened to all these albums again that I realised that this album just wasn't as good as the other two on the list. But damn, Shame is a fantastic record. I have closely followed Ed the Dog since the project was first announced. Frontman Ed Wettenhall was previously the frontman of an indie rock / math rock band called Fish Tank, of whom I was a really big fan. And after he released the astounding Funny Turns, I was super excited for the album, and it just completely blew me away. The album was written after Ed entered a self-imposed exile and explored the anxieties he was feeling at the time. The album explores themes of depression, breakups, and alcohol-fueled phone calls with exes. Ed's lyrics are constantly hilarious, self-aware, and paint a fantastic picture of his mental instabilities. Musically, the album is a super lo-fi, fuzzy, and very self-contained album full of punchy riffs, catchy melodies, and huge sing-along choruses. The album sounds like the result of taking Weezer and the Wombats and recording their music in someone's shed. The production and instrumentation, all done by Ed, are incredibly rough and almost amateurish, but that gives it this infectious charm. The album is fairly short, clocking in at 37 minutes, but its short length feels lean and straight to the point. It blasts by without ever getting boring or repetitive. Although a couple production choices here and there can be a little bit off, and I personally still don't really like the song Little Brother, hence why the album got knocked back a couple places. But regardless, this is still one of the best indie rock albums of the year, one that I see becoming an underground cult favourite, although it definitely deserves way more than that. I will admit, I never listened to the original version of Twin Fantasy, so this recent reworking / re-recording was my introduction to the album, and wow, what an incredible album this is. This album is easily one of the most exhilarating, well-written, and relentless albums of the year. Frontman Will Toledo does an incredible job of breathing new life into these songs and making them feel as fresh, honest, and youthful as ever. I'm sure people were skeptical that the new version of the album would lack all the charm of the original. The original version of Twin Fantasy is a classic lo-fi bedroom rock Bandcamp album that pretty much made Toledo a huge name in the online indie scene. And although I may not personally be into that rough, incredibly gritty sound, I can't deny that that original album has a lot of fantastic qualities, all of which I feel like were not only recreated here, but in many ways built upon perfectly. The production is super rough and raw and still manages to recreate the lo-fi bedroom recording sound of the original while also feeling much more polished. The album presents Toledo in the most vulnerable and open way we've seen of him to date, with him exploring his personal insecurities and odd sexual exploration in a way that is emotional, hilarious, and incredibly relatable, to the point where I felt like this album could have been written by the voice inside my head. The album feels almost like a personal letter to an ex where he tries to discover himself but feels even more lost than ever before. Toledo's vocals are just as incredible as they were on Teens of Denial, but in a way he sounds way more confident here. He's singing these incredibly personal songs in a way that sounds like he's basically saying, yeah, so what, this is who I am. Not only is the album incredible lyrically, it has some of the best instrumentation I've heard on an album in 2018. Apart from the song Stop Smoking, every single song on this album is at least 5 minutes long, with songs like Beach Life and Death and Famous Prophets reaching 13 and 16 minutes long respectively. The production and structure are so meticulously written to the point where everything feels perfectly planned and structured. The guitar riffs, solos, bass work, drum work, usage of lo-fi synthesizers and drum machines all create this incredibly noisy, cathartic, but super catchy record. Literally every single song on this album is flat out incredible, with songs like Bodies, Nervous Young Inhumans, Beach Life and Death, and Cute Thing being among my favourite songs of the past few years. Although I'm not sure it tops Teens of Denial, this album is still by far one of the greatest musical experiences I've had this year. I'd go as far to say that along with the #1 spot, it's one of my favourite albums of the whole decade. This is the bit you expect. There was a few more albums that I wanted to talk about, but they didn't make the cut, so honourable mention time.
Someday, someday,
I hated the life of Pablo, so I was not expecting anything special from Ye, but I hoped maybe we'd get something great considering the amount of hype behind his Wyoming Sessions project. As expected, Ye received a lot of mixed reviews, but I personally really liked it and considered it easily the best thing he's done since My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I love how personal Kanye got on the album, exploring themes of mental health and becoming a father. It's clear that Kanye is much more mature than ever before, but at the same time it's obvious that he's being torn apart mentally. It's an album that I think is the perfect representation of his bipolar disorder. The Pauses were a band recommended to me by Spotify. I listened to the song Digital Detox, which I absolutely adored, so I decided to check their 2 albums out. Unbuilding is definitely the better of the 2. It's this really great blending of indie tronica with 90s grunge. The songs are gritty, biting, and musically exciting. However, the album is really only at its best when the songs are fast and fun. The slower cuts are kind of what bring it down, although the embracing of jazz is pretty interesting.
I'm so reborn. I'm moving forward.
Yeah, I'll admit it, I didn't like this project as much as everyone and their mother did. I can't even say it's one that I've really returned to that much, but it's still full of some of the best production and songwriting of Kanye's career and shows him completely on form. However, I still really don't like Kid Cudi, so he kind of put me off this thing. I've really enjoyed the past stuff from Ninja Sex Party, but this album shows them that they're absolute best. It's a hilarious, really well-written piece of comedy rock with the best instrumentation and production the band have used to date. I'd go as far to say that this is probably one of the best comedy rock albums I've heard since the original Tenacious D album.
I want you so, and God must be the greatest comedian.
Pioneer of the schmaltzcore genre, Matt Maltese's debut is full of surreal, scathing humour, catchy choruses, and some of the most interesting instrumentation from any album this year. Although it's far from original, Maltese's blend of jazz pop and soul with contemporary indie rock makes it one of the more exciting albums of its kind. To be honest, I wanted to put it on the list, but I think I discovered it too late into the year to justify it. While every single emo fan in the world have been gushing over Basement for almost a decade now, I personally found them to be kind of hit or miss. I'm sure if I gave them a proper go I'd really like them, but Promise Everything and also seeing them live didn't really convince me. However, I felt like Beside Myself finally kind of turned my head towards them. It's much more polished than any of their albums before, and it goes in a much more grunge-inspired alternative rock direction than the emo sound of past releases, but it's a really catchy, exciting album full of huge riffs and some of the best scene hooks from the year. Man, Dead are kind of a sad story. Their EP and early singles were just incredible, and at that time they were easily one of the most exciting punk bands I've ever seen. However, this album was a little bit disappointing, and the 2 times I saw them after its release, they just weren't anywhere near as good. And now they've broken up, it's kind of obvious that something wasn't right there. Many of the songs on this album are really great, however. They're really gritty pop-punk anthems full of youthful energy and angst. It's just a shame that when the band try and experiment and do something different on the album, it just completely falls apart. It's very rare that a band puts out one of the best albums of the decade and follows it up a year later with an album just as good, maybe even slightly better than it. I sadly didn't discover Idols till this year, but when I first heard a song by them, I was completely floored. The band are an infectiously aggressive post-punk band, blending elements of hardcore with a huge experimental sound that transports you to this universe of hatred, anger, and annihilation. The instrumentation is both parts brooding and relentless. The progression through these sounds are summed up perfectly in the opening song Colossus, which starts off as an atmospheric piece of noise punk and then transitions into this rapid fire hardcore song. The band blend howling guitar riffs, punchy and heavily distorted basses, pounding drums, and some of the most effective politically charged lyrics from any band in years. Lead vocalist Joe Talbot has a very snarly, snotty voice that almost sounds like Johnny Rotten took a shot of testosterone and did a line of coat before screaming into the microphone at the top of his lungs. Lyrically, he tackles the modern British political landscape through songs such as Great, a huge anti-Brexit anthem that is as catchy as it is a punch to the gut. The song Never Fight a Man with a Perm tackles masculinity with some of the most hilarious and genius lyrics I've heard from any song this year. They tackle dark and important subjects with incredible energy, vigor, and a huge stream of pop culture references. Their passion of these subjects is shown all over the songs with their pure intensity, speed, and relentless structure, but they also know how to write songs that get the audience involved, whether it's by drop kicking the person next to them or screaming their lyrics at the top of their lungs. Songs like Television have these huge choruses that are incredibly aggressive and powerful but massively catchy. The album is a sarcastic, biting, and in-your-face piece of punk rock which takes the genre back to basics. It blends many of the best elements of classic punk bands like The Clash, Sex Pistols, and Wire together in a way that, although may not be incredibly original, feels more fresh and exciting than anything else that has come out in recent years, minus brutalism of course. These guys are possibly the most exciting band in the world right now, and I cannot wait to hear more from them in the future. I also am incredibly excited to get murdered when I see them in Brighton in a couple months. Idles proved that they're more than a one-hit wonder with this album, which is a near masterpiece punk record and easily one of the best in the genre to come from this decade. Thanks for watching, guys. Sorry for the wait on this video. It just ended up taking way longer than I expected to write. The same thing's kind of happening with the worst songs of the year video, which I don't know, it always takes longer than I expect for some reason. So hopefully that will be out in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for your patience with that one, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.